Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 8. Last week, we spent time discussing quasi-experimental designs for measuring impact outcomes, paying specific attention to the role of counterfactuals in estimates of program effects, the use of comparison groups, and the inherent vulnerability of bias in such designs. This week, we're going to move into control group design, which, depending on your background, may be familiar territory. Remember to continue to keep in mind that social interventions are typically more difficult to measure in the social realm, as they are often less tangible. As usual, just to situate ourselves, this week we're going to stay in the world of impact evaluations. So let's reflect for a moment. Let's return to what our goal is. Although every impact evaluation will revolve around evaluation questions that reflect the program at hand and the priorities of the stakeholders, at the highest level, each is tasked with finding out whether the program worked, meaning did it make a difference. Because of this, we are always seeking to compare the results of those exposed to the program against what would have happened without the program's intervention. Typically, this occurs by comparing the outcomes for program participants with those who were not exposed to the program. This is where establishing control conditions provides the best, most ideal opportunity to accurately capture this comparison by ensuring that some members of the target population are not offered access to the program. If you recall, although quasi-experimental designs using comparison groups have some advantages, such as at times being more practical or feasible, or having greater external validity, one of the fundamental issues that they face is that of selection bias. Controlled access to programs can help to alleviate this vulnerability, essentially eliminating the selection bias. Regardless of what design is used, ultimately the value lies in the credibility of the results. Evaluators rarely seek to apply these methods for knowledge generation alone. Rather, the results have an applied purpose. They are meant to inform discussions, decisions, and policies surrounding the program, continuing the program, shutting it down, making modifications, and so on. This depends on accurate results about the program effect. As you will recall, the program effect refers to a change in the target population or social conditions brought about by the program. That is, a change that would not have occurred without the program. As we discussed last week, this heavily relies on the ability to establish the counterfactual. One of the major weaknesses of the designs we looked at last week, though, was that the counterfactual estimates were very vulnerable to selection bias. So, controlled access to a program can help to alleviate the vulnerabilities innate to the comparison group designs by eliminating selection bias. Two prominent controlled access designs that evaluators use are randomized designs and regression discontinuity designs. The former, randomized designs, are reputed for their methodological rigor, producing the most credible estimates of program effects, while the latter, regression discontinuity designs, also produce estimates with a high degree of internal validity. That said, the practicality of executing such designs can prove challenging for evaluators. Indeed, it may not always be feasible to undertake such efforts. Rather than the default approach, the evaluator must find justification for using such designs. The justification usually means that the need for credible evidence about the impact must outweigh the potential consequences of limiting access to programs. As we will discuss, controlled designs can present ethical dilemmas related to who is able to access the social intervention and conversely who is not. Sometimes these ethical considerations will completely rule out the ability to complete a controlled design. There are two impact evaluation designs that control access to a program in ways that can eliminate selection bias, but they do so in very different ways. Randomized designs, also known as randomized control trials, RCTs, and randomized experiments, and then also regression discontinuity designs. These designs are widely considered the most rigorous options available for impact evaluations. It's at this point, though, that we need to keep clear the difference between our comparison groups from last week and our control groups that we're talking about this week, which directly points at the controlled access to the program. These two approaches, randomized designs and regression discontinuity designs, both establish control groups as part of their methodology. However, each does this in significantly different ways, with departures from one another on points of logic and the strategies used to create the groups. So let's just clarify for a moment. When I'm talking about control group designs, I'm referring to that classic design where we have an intervention group and we have a control group, and at the end of the day, we're going to compare the outcomes of each against each other statistically to find out the program effect. A control group design is only as good as the control group that is created to facilitate the comparison analysis. A key feature of this is that the two groups are equivalent to each other. For evaluators, equivalence is made up of three key components. The first is identical composition, meaning that we have the same mix of units, whether they be persons, households, communities, etc. This sameness refers to their program-related and outcome-related characteristics. So if, for example, hair color has no predicted correlation to the program delivery or the outcomes, then it isn't something that we need to have identical composition reflecting. The second point that we consider is identical predispositions. And this references the two groups being equally disposed toward the program and equally likely, without intervention, to attain any given outcome status. So here we are saying that the groups are equally ready for the program and equally likely to have similar outcomes if the program were not introduced. Thirdly, we're interested in identical experiences. Our groups will be observed over time. And here we are ensuring that outside of the program, they will experience the same time-related processes such as maturation, secular trends, and interfering events. Theoretically, we are looking for as close to perfect equivalence as possible, meaning perfect matches in all three areas. However, as we know, no two units are exactly the same in the real world. The beauty is we don't need an exact one-to-one equivalence. We just need that they average out to equivalent as a whole group and that the equivalences are related to the program outcomes. If, for example, hair color, again, has an entirely unrelated, is believed to be entirely unrelated to our program outcomes, we don't need to worry about group equivalence in this area. But if level of education does impact the outcomes, we want to ensure that the two groups are equivalent. So the question that arises then is how to achieve this aggregate equivalence, which brings us to random assignment, commonly called randomization. This is the best way to achieve the aggregate equivalence that we are seeking between our intervention group and our control groups. We use probabilities to determine whether a unit will receive the intervention or be placed in a control group. This allows us to ensure that the group level differences between the groups are only attributable to chance and not on known concerns for the evaluator. Although it may go without saying, it's important to clarify that the use of random here doesn't mean that it's a haphazard approach. Rather, it's the opposite, encapsulating tried and true probabilistic methods. At its simplest level, a coin toss or drawing names from a hat into each group can represent random assignment. Often, though, to achieve this purpose, evaluators will use computer-generated random numbers. In this process, a computer is used to create a sequence of numbers and these numbers are randomly assigned to the units. The sequence of numbers relies on algorithms to achieve a list with good random properties. The list of units with their randomly assigned numbers then can be used to separate them into the intervention group and the control group. Ultimately, going through this process results in several advantages to the evaluator. First is confidence that the differences between the intervention and control groups occurred literally by chance. Similarly, it gives us confidence that there is little to no selection bias possibly present. And as an extension, it gives us confidence that our internal validity will be good. Finally, it sets us up for the ability to conduct statistical significance testing, which gives us the ability to state a judgment backed by evidence about whether an observed difference between the two groups is likely to be by chance or actually represents a true difference. And we're going to take a closer look at what this means more in depth next week. For today's purpose, we're still building on last week's work, which is essentially before we measure any outcomes, designing and strategizing so that we have our comparison group or our control group, and we have our intervention group. We're sorting our people, we're sorting our sample of our target population into two bins in preparation for the actual outcome evaluation measurements. If evaluators aren't using a random control group design, but are still looking to have a control group, The second approach that we use is known as regression discontinuity designs. These deviate from that traditional control group because rather than relying on chance to assign individuals to the intervention or control groups, this method uses what we call a quantitative assignment variable, also called a forcing variable or a cutting point variable. It's a multi-stage process, and it involves first giving a score on the assignment variable to each individual, and we'll discuss the assignment variable a bit more in a minute. From there, one score within the range of all the values is designated as the cut point, which acts as a sort of threshold. So on the screen, if you were to line up all these dots, forget the outcome variable for a moment, line up all these dots along the x-axis, 50 is our assignment variable. It's our cut point. Once we have the cut point threshold, the values for the assignment are sorted and everybody scoring below that cut point, even by just a little bit, is assigned to one group and the remainder is assigned to the other group. You might be scratching your head at this point, and I was too the first time I learned about this approach. Once we've sorted our two bins into those that fall on the one side of the line, which are our intervention group, and those that fall on the other side of the line or the threshold, which are our control group, the scores on the program outcomes are compared. And as we can see on our very fictional graph here, we see our regression discontinuity plot. So at this point, we're plotting the results of our people along the assignment variable. We're plotting their outcome on an outcome variable along the y-axis, and we're now able to compare. The two groups are expected to be fairly similar to one another, with the exception that one group has access to the program. But how can we assume this? Especially since we're not doing a randomized process. We achieve this through how we set our cut point. It needs to be based on a criteria that are unrelated to the outcomes. So this could be any number of things depending on the program, such as the number of persons the program can take on, for example. The key is that this assignment variable and its related cut point is not related to the outcome variable. It's not expected to co-vary. It's not expected to influence the outcome. And thus, we know that it's not going to impact the outcome variable. When the cut point is truly made on independent factors, then the individuals closest to that line are effectively randomized, except for any influence on the outcome of their small remaining differences on the assignment variable. And these, once we get to our modeling, can be controlled statistically. Additionally, we mitigate the issue of selection bias, since the assignment process is the sole source of the assignment into the intervention or control groups. Of course, the further you go away from the cutoff point, the more likely that the estimates will be biased. And again, to manage this, the evaluator will factor this into their statistical model in order to control it. So just before we leave this slide, I just want to clarify something. When you look at our graph on the screen, we see the people that are clustered very closely to that cutoff point. These people, we run on an assumption with this model that these people are actually pretty similar. Whether you scored 49 or 51 could be purely by chance. It could be the day that it was measured. There's likely little significant difference between somebody who falls very closely on one side of the line and somebody who falls very closely on the other side of the line. So those individuals, the ones that are the closest to the cutoff point, are the ones we are most interested in for our comparison groups, because they are assumed to have that equivalence between them, because really there is assumed to be very little to negligible real difference between, like I said, scoring a 49 versus a 51. So let's move away from how we group our or assign our participants versus our control group. And let's just take a moment to step back and take a look at how the field of impact evaluation has been evolving. We haven't been around as long as a lot of the natural sciences or even a lot of the social sciences. We're still a fairly new field here. And as such, we've started to iron out some key conceptual definitions that help us keep an eye on the target and make sure that we're speaking the same language. And I want to make sure that we are also speaking the same language here. A key area that the text points out, and I agree that it's important to differentiate between, is efficacy and effectiveness. Often these are used synonymously in everyday language, but in evaluation work and in other disciplines. But for us, in evaluation work, these mean significantly different things. Efficacy and the associated efficacy evaluations are testing the outcomes of an intervention under ideal favorable conditions. Often they are small scale and they allow the program developer to see whether the program shows promise. The logic is that if the program works under the very best, most favorable conditions, it stands a chance of working in the real world, where the conditions may be less pristine. Validity is vital to these studies, and as such, random designs are often employed. These early studies, however, are often undertaken by program developers themselves rather than bringing on an evaluator. That said, if an evaluator is embedded as part of the program and project team, you might be asked to do one of these. Effectiveness evaluations, on the other hand, are looking to estimate the program's effect for a fully rolled out, usually ongoing program in real-world settings. In this case, the environment and the circumstances that the program is operating in are likely, with variations, less than ideal, and the program participants will represent the real characteristics of the target population. When sought after and where possible, an independent evaluator will adopt randomized designs, which are often called randomized field experiments. Just as a reminder, what works under ideal conditions is not guaranteed to perform well in the real world. Good results in optimum settings for an efficacy evaluation don't always translate into good results in everyday practice. And so even if an efficacy evaluation is done and the results look stellar, it's important to back that up down the road once the program's been fully rolled out with an effectiveness evaluation to see how it's doing in that more everyday, regular, real world delivery. Another key area of conceptualization for in impact evaluation has to do with our counterfactuals again. As we've been discussing, program effects are not determined in isolation. Rather, they will always be relative to the counterfactual group. While in more clinical studies, the control group will not receive any intervention or treatment, perhaps, for evaluations of social programs, the control groups are often still able to access any other treatments or interventions that are not part of the program. So if we are evaluating a program to, say, reduce homelessness, our control group may not have access to our particular program, but they could still access other community supports that are out there. This results in a variation of counterfactual conditions, which influence the questions that we are trying to answer in our evaluation, and sometimes really do have to shape the questions that our impact evaluation can answer. For programs where the counterfactual group does not actually have access to any other supports or interventions, perhaps our program really is the first thing running in the community or the neighborhood or whatever for the target population. If they have literally no other supports available, we can get a pretty decent and easier read on the program effects. These are the type of conditions that you might find in an efficacy evaluation, or where there are truly no other initiatives targeting the social need area. It allows us to isolate estimates and estimate the full ability of the program to affect change on the social condition, because we're literally looking at our program's impact compared to nothing else at all. More often than not, the program being evaluated is running alongside other programs, supports, or influences, and it is meant to add a meaningful component to what already exists. So in the case of our program targeting homelessness, perhaps our program adds a transitional residence for those actively seeking permanent homes of their own. This is a new addition to other supports, for example, such as monetary housing allowances, employment services, etc. Perhaps our transitional residence is an entirely new concept for our target population. Here we want to know what the difference of this new addition is, what difference it made compared to the outcomes of the standard programming. So we're not saying that that our control group can't be exposed to the status quo of its community, but rather we're saying, control group, continue on with the regular supports that you have available. Intervention group, we're going to add our program into the mix and see how it fares and compare that against the status quo. And finally, this leads into the question that we might be looking to see whether our program performs better than other programs. This may inform discussions about terminating an existing program if ours shows stronger outcomes. This relies heavily on answering questions of values and worth to gauge whether a new program should replace an existing program. And if you remember, early in the semester, we talked about how evaluation differs from purely research analysis because the evaluation seeks to determine, engage, and judge worth and value, not only analyze and present results. Regardless whether our program is operating with no other competing programs in the community, or whether our program is essentially competing with or looking to enhance other programs in the community. Regardless, our counterfactual, our idea of what would happen in the absence of our program, is different. Additionally, As you can see, these are very business-oriented questions. And this serves as a reminder that the question of does the program work is not really that simple of a question, but rather can take on a variety of meanings dependent on the purpose of the program and the stakeholder questions that need answers. The estimates of the counterfactual using control groups is not without debate. There are ethical arguments surrounding the use of control groups, with one of the biggest objections being that the control group is essentially being deprived of services and programs to assist them. While this is one of the louder concerns that is traditionally voiced whenever you bring up the idea of a control group model, it isn't completely accurate. None of the counterfactual groups that we have discussed on this slide have been deprived of services. Indeed, if other services existed, they could still access them. The only piece that they have been restricted from is our current program. The ability to access our current program could further help them. And that's at the heart of many arguments against randomized designs. Well, it could help them, but that runs on an underlying assumption that our program will help them and that we already know that this program is going to have a positive effect. And this is not guaranteed. Really, and we'll discuss this again in a couple of slides, but if the outcomes were so blatantly obvious, yes, it would be unethical to create a control group. But in this case, a randomized design would not be our best methodological option, and we could choose to evaluate the outcomes differently. Just because randomized designs are often viewed as the gold standard, or that there's a sense of pride that comes with the methodological rigor of randomized designs, it does not mean that they are always the best choice for every evaluation. This is where the evaluator needs to assess the situation and the context and adopt the most appropriate methodology for the evaluation at hand. Another key area for impact evaluations is what happens when our groups don't stay pure, when they don't stay the way that we originally designed them and where we assigned our units. As most of us have come to know, an ideal evaluation would present very clean-cut groups, those who participated in the intervention and those who didn't. But as often the case, this clarity can become cloudy very quickly because sometimes people that were assigned to the program group do not actually participate in the program, meaning they're non-compliant. Sometimes those assigned to the control group actually do find a way to participate in the program, meaning that they cross over. These situations resulted in the development of two main strategies for dealing with this mix-up whenever your randomized group doesn't receive or not receive the treatment as intended. So let's first look at what happens with our people who are non-compliant, meaning they were intended to receive the treatment, but they did not participate, and our crossovers, meaning those who were not supposed to receive our treatment, but still somehow managed to. One way to deal with this is what we call the intent to treat effects. So what we do here is we leave our people right where they were in their originally assigned groups. So let's take a little look at our picture here on the slide. On the first level at the top, we have our original randomization groups. Those with the party hats are our intervention group. Those without the little party hats were supposed to be our control group. drop down a level for me. As we can see, 2 of our intervention individuals did not participate. They lost their little party hats. Similarly, 4 of our control group managed to access the program somehow. So they actually received the intervention when they weren't supposed to, and they gained the little party hats. In this approach, the intent to treat effects, we essentially ignore these issues. We leave our people in the original randomized group that they were assigned to. ITT estimates compare the outcomes for the program and control groups as established, thereby preserving the strengths achieved through the randomization or cut point assignments. So our groups are preserved. However, the weakness is that because some people that should have gotten the intervention didn't, and some people who shouldn't have gotten the intervention did, it kind of dilutes the overall program effect. So the estimates for the program group should be viewed as conservative estimates of the true effect. Because had all of the people participated, chances are we would have seen a greater effect. But because those 2 did not, they're diluting that overall effect. When the purpose of the study is to see how well a program will work in the real world, ITT effects may be acceptable because really it does reflect the true dynamics that a program may face in the real world. Often when a program is rolled out, no matter how well constructed your intervention and control groups are, some people will drop out. Some people will find ways to access some of the content, if not all of the content, and it's going to kind of contaminate the original assignment of the groups. So intent to treat, if we're looking for kind of that external validity piece, it's pretty great for that. And it does preserve our randomization that we worked so hard to achieve. However, what happens when the proportion of crossovers, meaning the people who shouldn't have gotten the intervention, but somehow do manage to get the intervention? What happens when that proportion is substantial? In this case, this can overwhelm the estimate and leave us unable to accurately measure how well a program can perform if the participants fully experienced it. In this situation, evaluators will often examine each individual, determining who actually participated in the program and who didn't, regardless of which group they were originally assigned to. This results in what are called treatment on the treated effects. These naturally essentially eliminate the strengths that we achieved through our randomized approach because we are now taking everybody who received treatment and putting them together, and taking everybody who did not receive the treatment or the program and putting them together. And as you can see on the 3rd line, that just mixes up our original randomized groups. So we can no longer have that confidence that we gained in terms of selection bias, in terms of validity, internal validity. We no longer preserve that, but we also now can see everybody who had the intervention outcomes compared to everybody who did not have the intervention. So, what if our unit of assignment is not an individual? A guiding rule is that whatever the unit of assignment is, so too will it be the unit that program services are offered to and the unit of measurement for our outcomes. So if we assign individuals, we will offer the program to individuals, and we will measure the outcomes on individuals. What if our unit of assignment is an aggregate? Households, communities, provinces. The same holds true. Whatever unit we start with at the point of group assignment must remain the unit throughout the analysis. However, aggregate level units, which are often referred to as clusters, do offer some additional designs that we can undertake to account for the subunits that will naturally be found within the larger unit. One such approach is a cluster randomized trial. Here, clusters of individuals are identified and randomly assigned to the program conditions or the control conditions. The individuals within the cluster follow suit, either exposure to the program or not, depending on what the condition is that their cluster was assigned to. So basically, we end up with a design with multiple levels where our unit of assignment is still the individual, but they are nested within units at a higher level. With a cluster assignment, the number of individuals providing outcome data has to be larger, possibly considerably larger than the number required for individual random assignment in order to attain the same level of precision and statistical power to detect a program effect. These higher level clusters could be schools, hospitals, prisons, daycares, etc. Because of this higher level clustering, it's more possible for a program to be integrated into the setting as part of the daily business as usual. And because of the potentially large size of the clusters, it's possible that a representative sample can be used to assess the outcomes, thereby reducing overall costs. In addition to these and other advantages, there are also some drawbacks. Namely, that the individuals within each cluster are more likely to be more alike than those in other clusters, introducing some bias and reducing the statistical independence of each unit. And most obviously, designs of this type, they do require a large sample size. So I did put a quick little picture on it just because I do find that visualization often helps. So let's say that we're going to do a cluster randomized trial and our unit is elementary schools. Well, there might be 4 elementary schools within our target community, and we might be looking at grade 6 students for a reading program that we're looking to assess. So in this case, for example, it could look like this. School A, their grade 6 class receives the intervention. So does School C. Their 6th grade class also receives the intervention. School B and School D here are our control. The 6th grade classes at each of these schools will not receive the intervention. As you can see, it's probably a little bit easier to incorporate, say, this reading program into our grade 6 classrooms if we do it at a school level and a class level. That way the teacher doesn't have part of their students learning or working on reading strategies with the status quo curriculum, while their other students are exposed to this new, hopefully improved program intervention. So far, we've kept things fairly simple, addressing a single program condition compared to a control condition. However, this is an artificial limitation, just that I've been using, and I think the textbook does as well, just for the ease of explanation. All the approaches that we have spoken about can also be expanded to include multiple intervention conditions. Sometimes it may make logical sense, or we may be asked to evaluate two interventions. This is particularly true when there are multiple variations of the program being executed, and we want to compare, say, differences in the frequency or intensity of a program output. For example, perhaps we are running a 12-week program, and we've developed a new version that could be ran in 7 weeks. Perhaps now we want to conduct an evaluation on both strategies against a control group to be able to say, hey, if we do our 12-week group, if we do a 7-week group, what are the outcomes looking like relative to each other? And then how are both faring compared to the group that didn't receive our program at all? To do this, the evaluator can look at multiple sites, each assigned to a particular treatment, and each with a corresponding control group. The mind map, if you will, of this can become large and time-consuming if you picture multiple variations of a program or multiple interventions operating at the same time. It's a fairly complex program that's being offered. But it can be very effective, especially in situations where a program is seeking to improve upon an already tried and tested intervention to determine what the value added is, if there is a value added. I want to shift gears here and go back to what I alluded to earlier in terms of the ethical considerations that surround conducting a random assignment or a control group design. Often it is the most recognized, widely recognized approach. However, that doesn't always mean that it is the best choice for the situation, the context in which your program is operating on, or even the needs of your impact evaluation. Thankfully, there are precedents upon which we can gauge the ethical appropriateness of randomized field trials, and these guiding principles seek to balance the potential benefits to society against the protections of individual rights. The 5 statements on the screen should be, I would argue, revisited before any impact evaluation to kind of judge and assess whether or not a random assignment approach is even appropriate. So the first item is that the present practice needs improvement or is of doubtful effectiveness. So is our program already running and we know it needed to be improved and we need to assess it, or are we unsure of the results of our program? We don't know that it's doing good or potentially, unfortunately, doing harm. If that's true, if we're not sure about our program's direction of outcomes and impact, a random assignment approach may be appropriate. Similarly, if significant uncertainty exists about the value of the proposed intervention, a random assignment approach may be appropriate. Thirdly, sometimes a randomized experiment is the only practical means of determining effectiveness of the innovation. Sometimes, if we really want to be able to get into the nuance of our program's program effect, a randomized experiment may be the only practical means, in which case random assignment would be appropriate. Fourthly, If the evidence is to be used to inform future decisions about retaining status quo or implementing an innovation. So are our results going to be used to potentially discontinue another program? Are they going to be used to support not implementing our program because the results weren't giving us enough evidence that that was a good improvement over the status quo? If we need that level of evidence because some major decisions are going to be made off of it, a random assignment may be appropriate. And finally, experimentation may require different considerations, especially to protect human subjects in some fields, such as justice, than in others, such as medicine, because informed consent may not be possible. So this is that human rights piece, just making sure that we are paying due diligence to the potential harm that could come from a control group not receiving the intervention. Of course, even if a randomized trial passes the ethical debate, an evaluator needs to determine whether it is practical to undertake such a resource-intensive approach. As mentioned earlier, despite the highly prized status of randomized designs, which is not without merit, it still doesn't mean that every evaluation should employ these approaches. Indeed, randomized impact evaluations are recommended primarily when 3 criteria are met. 1, that there is sufficient reason to believe that the program is promising. Or 2, that there are concerns that the program may be damaging. And finally, 3, regardless of the answer to the first 2, it needs to be methodologically feasible to complete. In order to assess this, evaluators may wish to review prior studies, which can provide insight into whether other designs have been effective at capturing the program effects in studies of other interventions. It may reveal that less rigorous methodologies were actually adequate. Or we might want to conduct a pilot test involving randomized groups and test both the program and the design method on a smaller scale first. We can also explore how well our program population is adhering to the program as intended, the program fidelity piece. The greater the deviation in implementation and uptake, the less favorable the conditions are for a randomized design. And lastly, we need to make sure that we have the right data collection instruments. We can use the most complicated design, but if we are unable to measure outcomes and estimate counterfactuals well in such a design, it may result in an uncredible study. This is not to say that designs involving randomized assignment are not appropriate in some circumstances. It's merely to highlight that it may not always be the appropriate direction. Think of randomized assignment in comparison with comparison groups as a menu of options you have for setting up your population to receive or not receive the intervention. It's up to you as the evaluator to look at the context and circumstances of your program and the environment that it's running and the questions that the stakeholders are asking and the inevitable end result of what your results will be used for, whether it be to shape policy, to make decisions on program continuing, or whether to discontinue a program. It's up to you to look through that menu and select the best option. Sometimes your program, and I use this in class, is kind of like a piece of butter. You just need a butter knife. You don't need a sword to cut it. In that case, The butter knife would be like our comparison group designs. The sword would be more like our randomized control designs. Sometimes it's overkill. Revisiting the regression discontinuity designs, just recall that they are appropriate in circumstances when the evaluator cannot randomly assign members of the target population into the treatment and control groups, but it is possible to assign members based on their scores on a measure of their appropriateness for the intervention. The assignment variable is based on the concept that, or on a concept that is independent from the outcome of relevance. So that could be merit, need, the number of spots in a program, etc. A major benefit to this type of design is that it appears to have a level of innate fairness while producing an unbiased estimate of program effect. This is appealing to stakeholders and evaluators alike. In fact, this design method has become one of the more popular means to an end in the world of program evaluation. This has led to increased understanding of when the design is most appropriate to use, as well as a better understanding of how to execute it well. For this design to work well, there are a few key caveats to keep in mind. 1, the assignment variable does not actually need to be a valid measure. It simply needs to provide a numerical score along a continuum with an established cut point. The cut point must be established without considering how the point may impact the outcome, whether those above or below it may have more or less favorable chances of better outcomes. The cut point must be strictly adhered to, with no manipulation, whether intentional or unintentional. The development of the statistical model to be used must pay close attention to the assumption of randomization. If you recall, those cases near the cut point are assumed to reflect a sufficient degree of randomization, but the further away the points are from the cut point, the less of that assumption holds true. Often, if only the points close to the cut point are used, the sample size will be very low, drastically reducing the power of the statistical model. Rather than ignoring these points that are further away from the cut point, evaluators can and should work towards incorporating them into a statistical model that sufficiently accounts for the underlying relationships between the assignment variable and the outcome variable, which can reduce the bias and produce credible results. So, at the end of the day, the evaluator is placed in the position of being the expert, and the approach that they will take to the impact evaluation design will often fall to their discretion. So how does one decide? As we reviewed, comparison groups can often yield effect estimates that are similar to those that would come from a control group design. However, this is highly dependent on how the design is constructed and implemented, as well as the particular circumstances of the program and its participants. The evaluator must assess the various designs, factoring in the characteristics of the program and its delivery, the purpose of the impact evaluation and the stakeholder questions that are to be answered, the feasibility of control group designs, and a judgment call on whether the gains of a control design are worth the extra time, resources, and efforts, or whether a comparison group may still provide adequate answers, albeit with less methodological rigor. All the while, they need to keep in mind the potential vulnerabilities with respect to bias and how that may impact the final results. Unfortunately, there is no formula to provide clear direction on this. Experience and the constraints of the program and evaluation will often provide the guidance and the restrictions. We've covered some really good ground this class. I've chosen 2 small videos to close out the content that quickly summarize what we've been talking about and present it with some real-world context, which can sometimes really ground the material. I hope that they help, but I'm not going to show them to you in this presentation. I'm going to post the links to them. That way you can watch them on the side. Also, the audio recording within the PowerPoint presentation here was terrible. So I'd rather just give you the 2 links, and then that way you can adjust your volume as you need to when you watch them. They're very quick. Probably take about 10 minutes of your time total to watch both of them, and I really recommend them as applied opportunities. Additionally, I found a quick second video that is going to tackle regression discontinuity designs.
Out of the many projects financed by the European Union, some are more effective than others. The evaluation of policies is a key factor in understanding their impact. Regression discontinuity design, or RDD, is a powerful counterfactual impact evaluation method. Consider a program to support the job search of unemployed workers who are 25 years old or younger. How effective is the program in increasing their chances of finding a job? RDD looks at individuals who are slightly above the age of 25 and at those who are slightly below it. The fact that rules can be discretionary ensures that people close to the threshold are very similar, except for the fact of participating in the program. For example, consider Group A of unemployed people aged between 24 and 25, and Group B with ages between 26 and 27. These groups should have, on average, the same income, education, motivation, etc. Only Group A can take up the training, whereas Group B is excluded. The difference in the average employment rates between the 2 groups, the so-called RDD estimate, can hence be associated with their participation in the given training. Regression discontinuity design takes advantage of precise knowledge of threshold rules that determine participation in a certain program. This makes the regression discontinuity design a very powerful method to evaluate the impact of policies, and therefore helps to improve the design of future policies. For more information, visit the JRC website on microeconomic evaluation.
All right. And that brings us to the end. So, as you guys know from your syllabus, next week your 4th and final application assignment is due. Same as before, please respond via Blackboard, and please do use the text box rather than uploading a document. This time, I'm doing a very similar approach to application assignment number 3, where I'm providing you with a journal article and 3 questions to respond to. However, this time, you have a choice. I have chosen 2 journal articles, each have 3 questions about it, and you get to choose. So option A focuses more on Chapter 7 content with comparison groups and the introduction to quasi-experimental designs. Option B focuses more on Chapter 8, which is what we talked about today. You can choose either to do. If you're feeling particularly ambitious, you can do both, but you're not getting any extra marks from it. I just want you to be able to choose whichever one kind of strikes your interest and allows you to test your understanding of the material. So that will be due next Tuesday. Next week, we are on deck to not only move through more course material, but also go through some more details about your final assignment. So I look forward to seeing some of you in class, and for the rest of you, I will catch you on the recorded lecture once again. Have a great week. Take care.